This week, we're sharing a rare and intimate conversation between philanthropist and activist Azita Ardakani and her friend Krista Tippett, host of the award-winning podcast On Being. Tippett began the On Being project after accomplished stints as a journalist, author, and diplomat, and studying theology at Yale Divinity School. She was struck by a significant gap in the media landscape, a lack of deep, intelligent conversations to explore the spiritual, ethical, and moral aspects of human life. In this conversation, Ardakani and Tippett discuss the role of spiritual practice in the face of social crises, and how we can transcend the cultural and political divides that separate us from each other and from the natural world. Hope you enjoy it.
Welcome, everyone, to this wonderful space. I have the great joy of introducing this session. Many of you may feel that you already know Krista Tippett from hearing her award-winning radio show and podcast, On Being, but today we couldn't resist the opportunity for you to meet her in a new way, with the tables turned, being interviewed by her longtime friend and brilliant strategist, Azita Ardakani. Yeah, exactly. Two awesome women. On Being began as a radio show over 20 years ago, before podcasts were even a thing, and Krista's style, eloquence, and purview, illuminating the intersections among the mind, spirituality, consciousness, social healing, and poetry, soon evolved into a podcast that's now 1,200 episodes strong, filled with wonderful people, insights, and wisdom, and it's rated among the top 1% of podcasts. Christa is a Peabody Award-winning broadcaster, a National Humanities Medalist, and a New York Times best-selling author. Prior to this incarnation, she was a journalist and a diplomat in Cold War Berlin. She deeply appreciates the fractal nature of life and weaves so gracefully and eloquently between the inner transformations we're all challenged with at this time and the physical and structural changes that the world is asking for. She wrote this. I just love this quote, had to read it to you. "Every surface of fracture in our world notwithstanding, all of life is being revealed in its insistence on wholeness, the interplay between our bodies, the natural world, the lives we make, the worlds we create. It is the calling of callings to make that vivid and practical and real, starting inside ourselves and with the lives we've been given." And with the distinct honor of interviewing Krista is Azita Ardakani, whom I know and love as a woman of strategic brilliance, tremendous courage, creativity, and a deep devotion to justice and what I call mother life. In recent years, Azita has been exploring the intersection of law, policy, and storytelling. She's passionate about the expanded imagination of legal frameworks that can move policy and consciousness, such as more than human rights, as well as how enshrined inequity for women and girls in Iran and Afghanistan can be legally defined for what it is, gender apartheid. I'm so thankful to bring you this intimate conversation among two remarkably insightful, dimensional, and wise women who happen to also be good friends. Please welcome Krista Tippett and Azita Ardakani.
Good afternoon. You know, Krista and I were just talking backstage, and how many of you were at the morning sessions? Yeah. And we were saying, what is there to say? it really feels like we're standing on holy ground, and we are. The land that we're on, and the just enormity and depth and width of emotions and subjects that have already been brought up. So we just want to acknowledge that I think a lot of us are carrying a lot. I know I am still so moved, and in this age of can feel like consumptive inspiration. So I'm still metabolizing and trying to arrive.
So we were having the same feeling. I was feeling this morning like it was such a sacred space, and so much that was so important was being said, that I just felt like what I needed to be was silent before it. And I was thinking of this quote, and I think it's St. Augustine, and I may have this wrong, but he was talking about speaking of God, which of course is a word that is far too small to describe what it is we're pointing at. And he said, we speak in order not to remain altogether silent. And actually, that sense that he was speaking into of the sacredness feels consonant with being here.
So, with that, just to place each of us here, I think the context of place is so essential. So starting with the taproot of you coming from Shawnee, Oklahoma, you've said it's where you were born and raised, you fled from it, but for the first time, you're glad that's where you came from.
Yeah, that's true. I grew up in a small town, and I did feel like I fled for my life when I left. But I think over time, and then again, especially in a whole new way in the last few years, I've appreciated what growing up in that place meant to me, and how it has formed me, and also how at this stage in my life it gives me a lot of things to learn. I thought so much about this. I had an interview with Joy Harjo a couple of years. I don't know if anybody heard that, but she was in Tulsa, and she's from Tulsa, and we talked about how we are both from Oklahoma, but we essentially grew up in parallel universes. And I grew up in a town called, and what I'm going to say now is not something I reflected deeply on when I was living there, but I grew up in a town called Shawnee in Pottawatomie County. And the towns around it were Tecumseh and Seminole. I could go on and on. And it intrigues me at this point that those place names were kept, because the stories and the fact that they were the names of people and peoples completely fell away. So they were just names. And also what I knew then, but I'm really taking in now, is that Oklahoma was a place where people either came, as my grandfather did, in covered wagons, fleeing the past, fleeing all kinds of pasts, fleeing trauma, fleeing history, or forcibly marched. And no one talked about history. No one, this question that I started getting asked when I went to the East Coast, but that you get asked most places in this country, most places, where are you from? Where are your people from? Where's your family from? What's your ancestry? Nobody ever talked about that, at least among the people I grew up with. It wasn't an interesting question, and I think it had to do with not just not valuing history, but not wanting to go there. And when history is not present, you then have a very thin veneer of culture altogether. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's what I fled. But all these decades later, I'm understanding that.
Yeah. I think maybe you've heard me say, I feel like we're all Russian nesting dolls, and any one of us has a range of many from formative moments of our life, and sometimes not even formative moments of our lived experience, but of course our ancestors and the context. I was born in I was conceived during the Iran and Iraq War, and my mom was practicing Sufism, and so, I call it atmospheric mysticism in the same palm of a war, an act of war. And I think that contradiction, that those two things can happen at the same time, is a really interesting one. And for you, I know your grandfather, who was a Southern Baptist, I like this quote you said, it all came back to sex and not having it. Everything was about sex and not having it, yeah. He had this big, beautiful mind, and he treated his Bible like a scholarly text. But he was afraid to bring his questions to the Bible. And as a woman that lives questions, and I can't help but wonder what you were like as a kid. I know kids ask a lot of questions, but how has your grandfather's relationship to spirituality kind of tended yours?
And my grandfather had a second grade education. So I knew that he had an interesting mind. He could do these weird mathematical things in his head, but he had no education, and he hadn't been invited to value his mind, and I really actually felt like he would have been terrified to apply his mind too deeply, or to bring questions. The thing is, we all become, so a lot of, across the years, people have said to me, you must have grown up in a family of wonderful listeners. And I think, growing up in a family of wonderful listeners would be one way to become a wonderful listener, but the other way to become a wonderful listener is you grow up in a family where no one ever listens, and you crave it. And that was my story. And also, apart from the history of the world and the land and the place we inhabited not being spoken, my father was adopted, and his entire lineage altogether was a blank. And it was a terrible, he had been adopted when he was 4, so I don't know what happened to him, but it was awful. And so there was so much, this is true in any family, that what is not being spoken of is shaping you. It was quite dramatic in my family. So not only was nobody listening, the things that some part of me knew would be the things that we could talk about that would unlock us, that would be so much more important than everything we were talking about. And so I've only also realized this the last couple of years. That's what I did, right? That's what I do. I talk about the things that we're not talking about, and we should.
In listening to, I want to keep with like a certain chronology, but I want to jump here for a second. I listened to when it was on Faith, on radio. Before podcast, there was radio, and you, one of the earliest interviews you did was called "Where Are You, God?" And Where was God? Where was God? And it was after 9/11, and it was a series of trauma specialists and conflict resolution experts, and it was this broad conversation. And I looked at, kind of skimming through, preparing for this conversation, now knowing you, I was like, wow, I can really see the questions that you were wanting to hear, and also now hearing what was not being talked about, wanting to push that into the public sphere so that those conversations could be heard.
It's so funny that you mentioned that was 3 weeks after 9/11.
Yeah.
And I had been for about 2 years fighting to try to get something on the air, and literally not being given a key to the building, and I could like put my kids to bed, and I could turn up at 9:00, and then the engineer would let me in, and I was trying to I was trying to make the case that you could, and I want to say, talking about religion, spirituality, moral imagination, I want to talk about this part of us, this aspect of our humanity, this aspect of the human enterprise. But there was so much skepticism and, so much skepticism that it was serious enough to put on public radio for an hour a week, or that people wanted, if they don't they just want to keep this private. And then 9/11 happened, and we had an evangelical president in the White House at that point too. So, but when 9/11 happened, I was actually in Washington that day. I was supposed to have a meeting to raise what would have been our first big grant to make it a weekly show. And one of those airplanes flew over the Dulles Hilton where I was staying, and I got in a car and drove back to Minnesota, and I was kind of in shock. And I go into the vice president of news. He calls me in. This is like 2 days after. It took me 2 days to get back. And he says, "We need what you know," right? And I had just been beating down doors. I'd been just like humiliated and dismissed. And then he said, I said, of course, it was amazing. I said, I want to do something. I said, everybody's now learning about Islam, which already was the second largest religion in the world. And they're learning about it in this tragic way. And I said, I want to do something about, the spiritual, ascetic, intellectual heart of Islam. And he said, okay, we'll let you do that. But first we want you to do one called Where Was God? And all these fights I'd been having, right? Yeah. They suggest that I do something called Where Was God?
Yeah, and I think this is interesting because the quality of conversation that you're able to invoke, it's, I think, in part informed by your journalism training. And what does it mean to be a good host to a conversation? And what does it mean to create a container for a conversation, not just, and really asking questions isn't anticipating the answer you need to hear to keep pushing a conversation forward. So let's go to that time, on your 29th birthday, the wall had opened up in Cold War Berlin where you arrived.
And I was in Oklahoma.
And you were in Oklahoma. and you were driven to kind of study journalism and then pursue your master's in divinity. And what connected those two things of going from journalism to the master's in
journalism.
Yeah.
So very, very flukishly, from Shawnee, Oklahoma, I ended up in Cold War Berlin. And I started there as a journalist. I started there as the New York Times stringer, which I cannot tell you how flimsy that was, but I had those words dangling behind my name. And then I started to get to know this whole, I was in my 20s, I was very young, I was in my early 20s, and there was all this energy happening across the wall. But I want to just put this out here. What is so formative to me from those years that is so present with me now for us is that I lived in a world, in a handful of years where everybody knew that so much was shifting, but there was so much danger, and none of our imaginations reached far enough for what in fact was possible. Mm-hmm. No one believed that wall would come down in our lifetimes. The Chancellor of West Germany was out of the country that day. So those were years in which the world was about to completely change, to shift on its axis, and there was a lot going on. And I was I was curious, and I was close to the ground, and I was really young, and I had these journalistic visas that got me, and then I had a boyfriend, and it got me across the wall. And so I started saying, for example, actually, this is interesting in this room, that the Greens movement, which these are now the elder statesmen of Germany, right? They're so far ahead of us. The Greens movement was this nascent thing. It was this embryonic thing. And none of the diplomats or the serious people were taking it seriously. And then I was saying to them, I think you should, I think there's something here. And what was interesting too is that it became this moment across the wall, which was this geopolitical edifice, which had nuclear missiles on either side, pointed at both sides. But one of the realizations especially for the young people who that wall divided was none of it divided the air that they breathed. And that there was common cause in that. And the other thing that really shifted that is music, right? Western musicians started coming and playing concerts on the western side of the wall. And of course, music carried. And these were the radical things. What was your question? If I start talking about Berlin, I go on and on.
I've listened to you talk so much that I'm like, yes,
I know what it was. I know. I'll do quickly. So in the last year, partly because the older diplomats started realizing there were things that I could be useful, they hired me. And so I ended up with working for this ambassador who was a nuclear arms expert, and that was also the year that Gorbachev and Reagan were meeting, and nuclear arms negotiations were a big deal. And so I find myself sitting in these rooms with these men, and they were almost all men, and they were just like pushing these missiles around on a map of Europe like toys. And these were rooms of genuine power, and you could feel the genuine power. But I thought that we were there to save civilization. And when you're in the rooms, it was egos on the table.
Of course.
And it was I was so idealistic, and it was so dispiriting. Then at the same time, I'm having these experiences with real people close to the ground. And I had this observation that actually, is a core spiritual truth, but to really see this, so you have this city that's like a social experiment, and you have people on one side of the wall who live in capitalism, and it's like you and the other side in communism, and you basically have one people, one language, one history, one culture, split down the middle, given two completely different economic and political systems. One side is free, the other side is not. In terms of material reality, very different in terms of access to information, on and on. But what I saw is that people either created lives of dignity and intimacy and beauty, or they did not, and it wasn't about which side of that wall they landed on. And so I think I was having the experience of the power people and how I didn't want to be like them when I grew up. And how they just confused me. They confused my soul. And then I was finding this fascinating truth. And I ended up going to study theology because that was the discipline that I could see that had wrestled with this question, across generations, and created ritual and sacred text and community around it. I just wanted to investigate that. I didn't go because I wanted to be ordained. But I want to ask those questions. Have we talked about this? Because we're such good friends.
No. I'm on a new journey right now. I've been thinking a lot about, is contemplative practice a privilege? Mm-hmm. Who gets to have contemplative practice? And is a conversation that invokes vitality predicated on a regulated nervous system? Mm. These are things I'm sitting in, because when I myself, I was, as I said, born into a very active, conflict-ridden situation, highly dysregulated nervous system, myself and everyone that's around me. But I did have the atmosphere of mysticism and something whole.
Yeah, there was your mother being a contemplative presence.
Exactly.
And that was giving her a vitality that the circumstances of her life would have said was impossible, I suspect.
I think that's exactly it. And I think that now that I'm not actively, have done a lot of work to put my Russian nesting doll pieces together again and really investigate and understand what it means to be a mammal that moves through moments of time. And then privilege, like the privilege of contemplation. And what I've arrived at, because it's, speaking in this beautiful language can also be a barrier of entry sometimes. Like not everyone uses this kind of shared language or this access to language. But contemplative practice or access to vitality and soul life-giving practice is a birthright.
It is. I mean, I think this is similar to the question of, I was at a really serious, high-powered conference a few years ago, and a serious, high-powered person started it by saying, how could there be joy in a moment like this? Like, how could, joy, and I wasn't sure how I would talk to him about that. But I knew that was wrong, because joy is fuel. And joy is also fuel for resistance, right?
And contemplative practice or spirituality, and I even struggle with the word mindfulness, because the mind can be this incredible imaginal place, and we absolutely need the faculty of an imagination and the mind, and skillful intellect and ingenuity, and I feel like even the movement of mindfulness has been co-opted in some way, and really it's heartfulness or bodyfulness that we're pointing to in some ways. And I've watched in your podcast over the years this, not shift, it's always been in there. There's science, there's theology, there's all these incredible different kind of practices, and so much ecology and wisdom of the body. Do you see your evolution in the interviews that you've done and the subjects that you've been curious about?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say, I before we leave this behind, I think that's so, it's a hard thing to talk about, like why a contemplative space, or why the capacity for joy isn't a privilege. Like it, Drew Lanham, who's this ornithologist, this poet, he says joy, and I don't know, I'm conflating these things, but I think contemplation, or just having that space inside ourselves, that sacred space, and that space where we know how to get quiet, and reground again and again and again, and we don't stay there. He says joy is the justice we give to ourselves, that the world can't take away in the midst of what the world can take away. And it's true also of our inner life. And I would say that's what I was seeing in East Germany. And it's a mystery. And it's a good mystery.
And that miracle, not miracle, but kind of when it's little by little and then all at once, or in this moment you're looking at something and it's absolutely solid. And I see a correlation between so much of like the quantum physicists or the incredible scientists or astronomers you've had, where they're pointing to the same thing in different ways. And I love it when an interview starts with, "Oh, I'm not spiritual." And by the end of it, you're like, you just gave a sermon about the stars. What do you mean you're not spiritual? It's a scientist. And they're pointing, when someone has that integrated sense of just devotional love towards something other than their personal ego or their personal story, that is a bridge that takes us somewhere beyond ourselves. And I think that when I listen to so many of your interviews, sometimes I'm amazed that some of the most spiritual and, defined by everyone in this context in so many different ways, but I touch something bigger, come from the people that don't self-define in any way religious or spiritual.
It's all the words we need the most, including the word love, or the words around spirituality. They get overused, they get watered down, they get used wrong, right? Like mindfulness. There's mindfulness for productivity, and that's not what we're talking about. And yet, so we have to, one thing I try to do is use I think some of the words and justice is one of those words too. I think the words that we love the most, we again and again have to not know that those words don't carry they can't carry it for us, and they don't have all the connotations for other people that they have for us, and they might have difficult connotations that we don't know, and so you have to kind of surround it with an ecosystem of words to say what you're saying.
Yeah.
But in terms of this evolution, I think I was born in 1960, right? So I was born on the night John Kennedy was elected president. I think I'm really such a product of the 1960s, in the mid-20th century. Not the 60s, the mid-20th century, because I was too young, like I can miss the 60s, right? And the 60s never made it to Oklahoma anyway. But like that mid-century, and one of the features, I think, of the post-Enlightenment West, and certainly of America in the 20th century, and really of modernity. You and I are so in love with this book, Hospicing Modernity, and I think the author's here. I don't know if she's here in this room. But what was a feature? I think that if you have to boil it down to start talking about a feature, which I in a dinner party recently I had to do, it was like a feature of modernity was separation. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a really simple place to start. But it was separation between us and the natural world, separation from us and each other, all of our institutions and our disciplines in these separate categories that made all of them smaller and less interesting than they actually are. And also, we were divided up inside ourselves. I think people, if we survive, right, like Colette said, it all may go down and the phones will be off. But if we're around 50 years from now, I think people will look at this language of mind, body, spirit, and just think that is so nonsensical that we talked that way. Because everything we're learning, we didn't need science to learn this, but actually science is now showing us that like emotion lives in our bodies and trauma lives in our bodies, and there's more, the heart and the mind and emotion and thought, it's all entangled and it's all in interplay, wildly interactive all the time. And I would say, and also, societally in this country, one of the weird things we did when we thought we had discovered diversity is we started creating these places of tolerance, which is such a dead value. How
do you really feel?
Huh? Well, the definition of tolerance in the medical vocabulary, where it comes from, is the limits of thriving in an unfavorable environment. Oof. Really, it's like the question is, how much can you tolerate? And that was a civic virtue we adopted it's not like diversity was new in the 1960s, but we were acknowledging it. And it was also diversity of thought as well as identity. But one of the features of that we're now really, really struggling with is we created these like values neutral spaces in order for people not to be offended, right? So that you check your values and your moral values or your moral identity at the door of your workplace, or we took, any talk of, I think the idea was to take, religious dogma out of public school, but we took spirituality. We took the spiritual aspect of students and teachers out of schools, right? So I grew up in this world that was kind of defined by these divisions, and we were defined by our divisions. And so for me, just as a human being, but then this has been a lovely thing about, doing this work, because and I don't know which one came first, but I think as I have kind of been on a journey or evolving, then I've gotten to just find the conversation partners I want to have. And at some point I said to myself, and I don't know when I crossed this, but I said, I'm no longer interested in spirituality that is merely spiritual. For me personally, like it's everything is about being embodied, and even spirituality has to be embodied. And that also means, that's not just about feeling in your body. It's like, are you present to the world? And I actually think so much of our interaction with each other happens at an animal level. Like, I'm all about words, and I'm all about choosing words carefully, and yet, one of the things that's happening in our public life right now is that we meet each other, and with all of our fear, and which we armor up and call anger, and all of our thinking that we know what that other person is about just because we know who they voted for, that we know something about their identity. And they know at an animal level, even if we're ready to act nice or ask a curious sounding question, they know at an animal level whether they're safe with us or not, or whether we really care. It's all physical. It's all physicality. It's all physicality. And then as we realize this again, we start to remember our belonging to the natural world, right? That separation is the most artificial and destructive of all.
In a way, you answered the previous question of or at least reprovoked it, is having a generative conversation predicated on a regulated nervous system.
Yeah.
And that would require someone to know they have a nervous system. And we're in a time where, everything is provoking us as mammals. And for the most part, people don't realize they're mammals.
Yeah.
And even some of the most beautiful hearts and minds I know, I am watching them in the moment when the conversation is there and the difference is laid out between them. They cannot meet the moment. And it is breaking my heart. It is breaking my heart.
And even Western medicine doesn't know about the nervous system. That is the tragedy here, right?
Where do we go from here?
Your doctor does not know much about the stress response. How do you know? Where does this come from in you that you know this?
Well, I think, not to reiterate the taproot of my own life, but I think there's something about, one, even though I was born in the war, I was also born in a very natural place. My family fled Tehran. So I think my 0 to 2 being in nature and having my cellular memory be in a whole place is a part of it. I think that being in spaces where people were emptying themselves as vessels and just being in prayer, devotional prayer, humble-filled prayer.
Sufi prayer, you mean?
Sufi prayer.
Which is completely physical. What is it like? Well, the dervishes were about
there's that
staying centered while whirling or something. Isn't
and actually in some of the kind of ancient Persian traditions, when someone had what would be now called a mental health problem, they were sent to the Sufis when they would come through town, and they would swirl with the dervishes. Yeah. And they would say that would move the demons or energies or whatever else that was taking over them at that time. And there was just this sense of, they just need to swirl it out, Yeah. And these are ancient traditions. So I think for me, I know of some part of you needs to know what okay feels like to know when you're not okay. And the heartbreaking part is that right now we have generations of people, and of course pre-generations of people, that are fruiting bodies of trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And in this country that's very wealthy, though poverty-stricken in so many ways, we have all these mobile phones and food systems that are also just at a base level, not allowing us to have a fighting chance in some ways. So I feel this call that to even be available to have some of the conversations that are most necessary, there almost needs to be like a base literacy of how we human, how we're put together, how we are one singular human species, how when I get scared or nervous, my blood vessels constrict and I can't take in information the same way. These base things, especially if you call yourself someone and a leader in a field of repair, it is so essential to even know who you're talking to and are they okay to receive information from you at that time. But to the point of being this addiction to rationality or modernity that is the water we all swim in, spaciousness, taking a breath in times of urgency, when the conversations need to be had and the strategies need to be built and the movements need to be done, feels so counterintuitive.
And yet that is a technology, right? It's like a spiritual, physical technology that is so critical.
Yeah.
Something that really fascinates me. So what fascinates me is how I see, as I'm learning about these things you're talking about, I start to hear how our language, like we have phrases that we use all the time that actually show that we have had this intelligence that's about what's going on in our bodies, and now we're getting consciousness about it. So for example, like I learn about the vagus nerve, which is also...
You're a little late, bro.
So the vagus nerve, which is also one of these things that seems is so critical and doctors don't, they're just not paying attention to it. And so like the vagus nerve is called the wandering nerve and Resma Menakem calls it the soul nerve, and it like winds through. So where does it go? It goes through the amygdala, through the throat, the heart, the gut. And okay, think about when we say, I feel nervous. What are the symptoms of feeling nervous? Fear. Throat tightens up. Heart is pounding. Gut is churning. That is fascinating to me.
It is.
Here's another one. We say, I was beside myself with grief. What we know scientifically or psychologically now is that like in moments of trauma, high stress trauma, like you literally disassociate.
Yes.
But that metaphor perfectly describes this physiological thing or this psychic physiological thing that's happening.
And, I'm going to contradict myself. It's like, I want there to be more literacy about this. And I think about the interview you did with Desmond Tutu or so many others that have held space for, the one with Desmond Tutu, he talks about the 20,000 people that participated in the truth and reconciliation process. And he says,
Can I say how relaxing it is to have you be the one looking at your notes? And I'm just like waiting to see what you say next.
by the way, this is my first interview ever. She was
doing such a great job.
I am beside myself. I am nervous. Thank you. Thank you so much.
A natural.
And he talks about people who have suffered grievously. They have a divine right to be angry. They are allowed to be filled with lust for revenge. And so frequently when he was listening to the stories, he said, I wanted to take my shoes off and say, I am standing on holy ground. Yeah. And that we are, much like you're talking about the Berlin Wall or, Thich Nhat Hanh talking about the time in Vietnam, about this practice as strength, as a muscle, these things that we can actually reach for, and that we are, when it's actually to the very edge of when we think we have lost everything, that the end of our humanity, that we could not see any more darkness we can surprise ourselves, and we have. And that space, one of my teachers who's probably here right now said in a couples counseling session, she said, the differences between you are sacred territory.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot, that while these bodies have so much complexity and we don't understand nearly enough of how they work, we are capable of standing together with enormous differences, with violence that is unnameable and honestly hard to understand sometimes, and still move through these thresholds.
Yeah, I don't know why this is what comes to me. A couple of things come to me about Thich Nhat Hanh. I just recently learned, I'm just really holding this, that, and I'm sure some of you know Thai and his teachings and that beautiful lineage of Plum Village, and their retreat center is in France, and that's where he went in exile. He was forced to leave Vietnam. They chose to build the retreat center in a place in France where, under the Nazi occupation of France, a collaborator had been shot by local people. And it was considered by the local people to be haunted. And so nobody wanted this piece of land. Nobody wanted to go near it. And Thai specifically said, this is precisely where we build, where we bring contemplation and community. And that's counterintuitive and it's countercultural. And I'm really thinking about that. Like, what will be the next opportunity that I have, like in some much smaller, less dramatic way to do that? But the other place that that takes me, what you just said, is this is a reason that I think this mystery of us, this complexity, it's so funny because in the 20 years that I've been doing this particular work, looking at this part of the human condition and this part of the human enterprise, religion has declined in terms of, I mean, it really, in this very short period of time, in this country, in the West, in the North, we've gone from being a species where in almost every culture across time, people inherited religious identities and rituals and texts and all that. It came like hair color. And then in this very short period of time, there are a lot of us for whom that has totally fallen away. And some of that is because the forms, like the forms of most of our disciplines, medicine, schools, the law, politics, the economy, they don't work for us as human beings. And it's true of religious institutions too. And in fact, like it's not in the Bible that church is at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, for example. So there's a lot of like form thing that doesn't work, but there's also really significant ways that it doesn't work, that it's not working. And at the same time, just in the last year or two, I have never felt like theological, like deep, sacred theological language has been more relevant. So that thing that Desmond Tutu was talking about, like, a word like repentance, the possibility of redemption, right? Confession. We actually need that language, lamentation, and I'm just now giving kind of Jewish Christian terms, right? Like, we do need, because those words are bigger than the secular, institutional, official language we use, and we need, and they have traditions, and they have conversation across generations attached, and yeah, we are going to need to recover these things in our midst. Even if and as religion as we've known it goes away.
We really are in these, I say often, like, I feel like my ceiling becomes my floor all the time, where I'm like, okay, I think, and because modernity wants solutions, and there are no solutions in this way. And the water we swim in has actually, Nina was kind of speaking about this morning, how even when you're trying to take good, skillful action, you can actually set a downstream consequences when they haven't really been investigated and run through a coherent system and run through cultural context and run through earth more than human context. And that rugged individualism, and where has it gotten us? So I'm getting to skillful action. What does it mean to take skillful action? And I'm thinking, going to go back to Thich Nhat Hanh. I was with some of his monastics last summer. And this story I've reached for so many times, where during the Vietnam War, there was bombing nearby the monastery. And they would go and they would do their version of service and care and repair. And months later, there would be another bombing, and he would call on the monastics to go and serve. And the third time it happened, just months later, some of the monastics turned to Thai and said, why are we doing this? Let's just wait for the war to be over, or this feels futile. And he said, do you think we do this because you get to know it lasts? We do this because it is the next right action within arm's reach. It can be so overwhelming right now to even know where to begin. And we're not meant, the amount of technology that allows us the level of exposure to climate and environment and war and pathogens, and if you're an empathic little animal, which even if you say you're not, you're taking in information all the time, it is a lot. It is a lot to do. So to not have an interior life to go to run it through, to make sense of what is the best next step within arm's reach that is mine to do, is so sad to me that there's this void of place for people to reach to. And I think that's why On Being, for me, has been revelatory, that in public life, the conversation is just so small. And we know how to ignite outrage in 5 words, but we don't know how to invoke humanity through these shared mediums.
Yeah, I was saying that. I mean, that overwhelm of being alive right now is also is why we need each other. And we really are conditioned, and it was said this morning, we are just so conditioned, and to an extent that I don't think most of us really, really know that, that we're supposed to get to it alone and reach out if we need help. We need help all the time. And, the virtues, right? These things that are going to get us from here to there, like hope and love and imagination, and patience where that is what is called for, and also right action in the face of urgency where that is called for. We, in order to carry those things, something that it feels new to me about this time and this generation, and I mean the new generation of humans, but I also mean the generation of our species, of those of us who are alive now, is that the work, the challenges, I like to say the callings, same thing, crises, challenges, callings that are before us, this is the work of the rest of our lifetimes. So there's nothing before us that's going to be done in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. And I think, I have to operate on the idea now that everything that I'm working towards, I will not see the end of.
Yeah.
And I even meet 25-year-olds who feel that way. And that is really like an evolution of wisdom. One of the implications of that Because holding hope and love and imagination and all of that, with that time span, which our bodies and brains don't quite know how to do,
Yeah.
our animal bodies and brains, that means we have to surround ourselves with others who can hold hope and love for us on the days or years when it is too much for us to ask of ourselves. But just that move of creating that kind of friendship and kinship, right? And community, and really, like, we overuse the word community. So this is a new level of community. That is absolutely essential. And it will be life-giving. And it's not going to feel natural, as lovely as it sounds.
Well, there's both, what are we willing to give up for the world that we actually maybe you don't want to live in it, but you won't live in this one for much longer. So there's no proverbial we as we're talking. I'm aware that the we is self-selective of the we in this room. Yeah. But I want to go to living the question. Will you share the Rilke quote you love?
Yes. Yes. Rainer Maria Rilke, who was, he's called a German poet, but actually he inhabited this Central Europe that doesn't exist anymore. It was kind of this middle zone, and German was the language, but we would call Czech, and so it was a world that vanished. And I like to think that part of the reason Rilke feels like such a friend now is that he also inhabited this young century, as we do, a young century, the last young century. And what was ahead in 1914 and 1933 and beyond was, beyond catastrophic. So he said, he was counseling, I feel like elaborating so much, but everybody called it Letters to a Young Poet, right? So these were letters that were published posthumously or later. But this young poet was actually a military officer. He was a young military officer who wanted to be a poet. And I think that's important. He was not just a poet sitting by a window somewhere writing, and he didn't actually leave the military service to become a poet.
He may have sat by a window.
He what?
He may have sat
by a window. I don't think his poetry is very good, but so he's a person. He's a military officer who wants to write poetry, and he writes Rilke these letters about how do I become a writer, how do I become a poet. So it's in that context that he's writing to him, but he actually writes to him about being a human being. And so in this one place, he says, you're so impatient for the answers, and he said, do not. He basically said you have to stop searching for the answers if you can't live them. He said you need to hold and love the questions themselves. And this is where, to me, the upshot of this is, I'm going to give you the full quote, but when to rush to an answer would be to deny the gravity of the question, right? Which is where we are. You have to stay with the question. And he said, you should love the questions themselves as though they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. You live the questions until you can, and then he said, until one day, perhaps without even noticing it, you live your way into the answers.
And I love this. So Padraig Otwama, that we both love, who does Poetry on Bound, something I pulled that he said is that you will avoid questions that are the ones most urgently in need of your attention.
Yeah.